Hi, my name is Debbie Longo, and I am the Transaction and Compliance Coach for the PC program here at Keller Williams Realty Success. Today, we will be learning about the Massachusetts Mandatory Real Estate Licensee Consumer Relationship Disclosure, also referred to as the Mandatory Disclosure. First, we will go over the terms and information on the form and then how to properly complete the form. I'm available for one-to-one sessions if you need further assistance. So let's open your binders to transactions. I would prefer that you use the form in your binder so that you have a template. Something that I can't stress enough with all of the forms that you will be using is for you to read and understand each form. Don't just send it to your clients and say, here, sign this. Whether it's just information or a contract, know and understand what you are presenting to them and be able to educate your clients. So let's get started. So as you can see, this is a form that's submitted to us by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It is a required document, but it's not a contract. This disclosure is provided to you, the consumer, by the real estate licensee listed in this disclosure. This is for information for the consumer. It explains how they can be represented and what their duties are, as well as what your duties are. Like I said, this is not a contract. It's just for information so that they can be better educated consumers. So let's read through this. The most asked question about this form is, when do I need to give this form to the consumer? The time when the real estate licensee must provide this notice to the consumer. All real estate licensees must present this form to you at the first personal meeting with you to discuss a specific property. In the event the relationship changes, an additional disclosure may be provided and completed at that time. Consumer information and responsibility. This is something that you need to explain to your consumer. If you are a buyer or a seller, you can engage a real estate licensee to provide advice, assistance, and representation to you as an agent. The real estate licensee can represent you as the seller, as a seller's agent, or represent you as the buyer, as a buyer's agent, or can assist you as a facilitator. All real estate licensees, regardless of the working relationship with the consumer, must, by law, present properties honestly and accurately and disclose known material defects in the real estate. The duties of a real estate licensee do not relieve consumers of the responsibility to protect their own interests. If you need advice for legal, tax, insurance, zoning, permitted use, or land survey matters, it is your responsibility to consult a professional in those areas. Real estate licensees do not and cannot perform home, lead paint, or insect inspections, nor do they perform septic systems, wetlands, or environmental evaluations. Do not assume that a real estate licensee works solely for you unless you have an agreement for that relationship. As I stated before, this just breaks down the difference of how they can be represented and what the duties are. So skipping to the second page, the types of agency representation. So a seller's agent. So somebody wants to list their property, you're going to represent them as a seller's agent. A seller can engage the services of a real estate licensee to act as the seller's agent in the sale of the seller's property. This means that the real estate agent represents the seller, who is a client. The agent owes the seller client undivided loyalty, reasonable care, disclosure, obedience to lawful instruction, confidentiality, and accounting. The agent must put the seller's interest first and attempt to negotiate price and terms acceptable to their seller client. The seller may authorize sub-agents to represent him or her in marketing its property to buyers. However, the seller should be aware that the wrongful action by the real estate agent or sub-agents may subject the seller to legal liability for those wrongful actions. The same can be said for a buyer's agent. It just is the other side of the table. So a buyer can engage the services of a real estate licensee to act as the buyer's agent in the purchase of a property. This means that the real estate agent represents the buyer, who is a client. The agent owes the buyer-client undivided loyalty, reasonable care, disclosure, obedience to lawful instruction, confidentiality, and accounting. The agent must put the buyer's interests first and attempt to negotiate price and terms acceptable to their buyer-client. The buyer may also authorize subagents to represent him or her in purchasing property. However, the buyer should be aware that wrongful action by a real estate agent or the subagents may subject the buyer to legal liability for those wrongful actions. The next one is a facilitator. Now, this one has a lot of people confused. It's something that I would really like for you to dive into and learn more about it. We can discuss this further in person. When a real estate licensee works as a facilitator, that licensee assists the seller and/or buyer in reaching an agreement, but does not represent either the seller or the buyer in the transaction. The facilitator and the broker with whom the facilitator is affiliated owe the seller and buyer a duty to present all real property honestly and accurately by disclosing no material defects, and owe a duty to account for funds. Unless otherwise agreed, the facilitator has no duty to keep information received from a seller or buyer confidential. Should the seller and/or buyer expressly agree, a facilitator relationship can be changed to a seller or buyer-client relationship with a written agreement of the person so represented. So designated seller and buyer agent. Real estate licensee can be designated by another real estate licensee, the appointing or designating agent, to represent a buyer or seller, provided the buyer or the seller expressly agrees to such designation. The real estate licensee, once so designated, is then the agent for the buyer or the seller, who becomes the agent's client. The designated agent owes the buyer-client or seller-client undivided loyalty, reasonable care, disclosure, obedience to lawful instruction, confidentiality, and accounting. The agent must put their client's interests first and attempt to negotiate price and terms acceptable to their client. No other licensees affiliated with the same firm represent the client unless otherwise agreed upon by the client. In situations where the appointing agent designates another agent to represent the seller and an agent to represent the buyer in the same transaction, then the appointing agent becomes a dual agent. Consequently, a dual agent cannot fully satisfy the duties of loyalty, full disclosure, obedience to lawful instruction, which is required of a seller or buyer agent. Only your designated agent represents your interests. Written consent for designated agency must be provided before a potential transaction is identified, but in any event, no later than prior to the execution of a written agreement for purchase or sale of residential property. The consent must contain the information provided for in the regulations of the Massachusetts Board of Registration of Real Estate Brokers and Salespeople. A sample of the consent form, the consent to designated agency, is available on the board's website. So a dual agent. A real estate licensee may act as a dual agent representing both the seller and buyer in a transaction, but only with the express and informed written consent of both the seller and the buyer. A dual agent shall be neutral with regard to any conflicting interest of the seller and buyer. Consequently, a dual agent cannot satisfy fully the duties of loyalty, full disclosure, obedience to lawful instructions, which is required of a seller or buyer agent. A dual agent does, however, still owe a duty of confidentiality of material information and accounting for funds. Written consent for dual agency must be provided before a potential transaction is identified, but in any event, no later than prior to the execution of a written agreement for the purchase or sale of residential property. The consent must contain the information provided for in the regulations of the Massachusetts Board of Registration of Real Estate Brokers and Salespeople. A sample consent to dual agency is available on the board's website. So let's go back to the part where you give this form to the consumer. They're a consumer until they become a client. When you have a contract with them, that's when they become a client. This is not a contract. This is just information. So the seller or buyer receiving this disclosure is hereby advised that the real estate licensee named below is working as, in this instance, we're going to go for a buyer's agent. So I'm representing Debbie Longo in a transaction for as a buyer's agent. If the seller's or buyer's agent is checked above, the real estate licensee must complete the following section. So this distinguishes what kind of agency we are. So our office is a designated agency. So what that means is that only the licensee named herein represents the buyer, designated buyer agency. In this situation, any other agents affiliated with the firm or business listed below do not represent you and may represent another party in your real estate transaction. So somebody else in our office may represent the seller or another buyer that comes along in the transaction. So by signing below, I, the real estate licensee, acknowledge that this disclosure has been provided to the consumer named herein. So this bottom section contains your name, your signature, your license number, what you are, a salesperson or a broker. In the beginning of your real estate career, you're going to be a salesperson for at least the first 3 years. After that time has passed and so many transactions, you can apply for your broker license. So for this instance, the first section you would sign your name. In this section, you print your name, your full name, whatever the name is that's on your license. Your license number goes here. Your license number is the number that is on the license that was issued to you when you passed your test. You're a salesperson, and make sure that the form is dated. The name of the real estate brokerage firm is Keller Williams Realty. Our license number is 7874. This is a number that you want to have handy. You can use this form as a template. This number will always be here. So the bottom 2 lines are for the consumer to sign. Whether you have 1 or 2, they're going to be signing this first part, printing their name in the second part, and distinguishing what they are, a buyer or a seller, and make sure that the form is dated. If for some reason the consumer declines to sign this notice, you can still give it to them, but if they decline to sign it, you need to check this box. It either has to have this box checked or it has to have their signature. These forms need to be kept on record in the office. The board goes through and does audits, and they want to make sure that this form is being handed to every person at a specific property at the first meeting. If they meet with a real estate agent, this form needs to be given to them. So if you have any questions with this, just let me know. I'm always here to discuss. Thanks.